Welcome back
to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. Okay, hold on.
That's a good one.
I'm going to leave it though. Okay. Welcome back to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. On today's episode, we're going to cover a topic that I'm sure is going to be popular. However, I don't think it's something that the majority of trainees should be implementing with their training all the time. And it's going to be 2 times per day training. That was a bit of a hectic start. We'll pull it together. So regarding 2-a-day training, it's multifaceted. It's not something that it's just 2 strength training sessions per day. So we're going to cover a wide range of 2-a-day training on this episode. But to get us started, I'm going to kick it over to Steph.
So because you forgot to say it, and I'm not being messed up, let's kick it.
Good job.
Good job.
So 2-a-day training. So like you said, it's not necessarily for everyone because it is quite demanding. You need to be able to recover from it for it to be effective. And in order to recover from training, you need to have a certain level of experience, at least intermediate level of experience. You need to have your lifestyle and nutrition in check. So good sleep and on and on and on and on. But for those of you who have the lifestyle in check and want to push their training to the next level and speed up the rate of progress, 2-a-day training is definitely beneficial. Now, in 2018, I wrote an article for Thib Army on 2-a-day training, and the purpose of that article was a little different than what everything else that was out there in terms of 2-a-day training, in the sense that I was talking about the planning or the timing of 2-a-day training in the context of a year of training. So the periodization of 2-a-day training. So before we get into the specifics, I would just like to talk about the periodization of 2-a-day training to maximize its effect. So 2-a-day training, unless you're a pure freak of nature, it should be something you do at very specific time frames once in a while. It shouldn't be a thing you do all the time, okay? And I have an online client that I still train to this day. I've been training him for 10 years now.
Oh, I'm sure he's listening to this.
He's most likely listening to it. And early in his training career, he really wanted to do 2-a-day training, but he wanted to do 2-a-day training all the time. And against my advice, he really wanted to do it. So I'm like, okay, let's do it. So he did 1 year straight of 2-a-day training, and it led to a lot of issues that to this day we're kind of still dealing with. I'm not saying that it's the only reason, but
it didn't help.
It didn't help. It's really hard to cope with that level of training frequency and high intensity for this long. So ideally, assuming you're using phase undulating periodization, so the classic undulating periodization that we use for the majority of our training. So we're alternating between accumulation and intensification phases within a macro cycle. And then we typically have 4 macro cycles per year, where between each macro cycle, we have a week of active recovery. So 4 macro cycles a year. Now, typically, we undulate the phase, but we also undulate the macro cycles. So the second and the fourth macro cycle are typically the most intense macro cycles of the training year. And the first and the third are less intense, but typically have more volume. So what you want to do to optimize the effect of 2-a-day training is to implement 2-a-day training in the third macro cycle of the year, which is the macro cycle where the overall training volume should be the highest. So it makes sense on a training perspective. It makes sense on a recovery perspective in the sense that you've built yourself up through that year of training to have the skills and ability to be able to cope with that extra amount of volume that you have to deal with. So the third macro cycle, and then within that third macro cycle, depending on your ability to recover, you could do it either in both accumulation phase of the macro, or if it's your first exposure, you would do it in the second accumulation phase of that macro cycle, where that second accumulation phase is the phase where you have the most volume within a 12-week macro cycle. So it just makes sense on a programming perspective. So this is where I would do it at first. It just makes sense. And then it will definitely like springboard your training potential to peak in that last macro cycle of the year, where you have to exert the highest level of intensity with the smallest level of volume. So to precede that phase with one macro where you draw volume higher than normal will act, if you want, as a overreaching leading to a peak. So it's really good that way. So as you can see, 2-a-day training in the context of the year of training, we're talking about 1 or 2 phases. Or if you're a full-blown machine, maybe 4 phases out of a year, which would be in macro 1 and macro 2. But this, to be quite honest, shouldn't happen very often.
Macro 1 and macro 3.
Macro 1 and 3. But it shouldn't happen very often.
In regards to just personally, I know it might be a little bit harder for you two because you've been training so much longer, but I know personally for me, just doing 2-a-day strength training, since I started training in 2012 under you guys, I've only done it twice the whole time. You, Porik?
I think I've only done it once. Yeah.
And then you guys?
I've done it a bunch, but
Yeah.
I've also been... I mean, the thing with me is I've tried so many things for the sake of trying so many things. So I'm not necessarily the poster child for proper long-term progress. I've done it a ton.
Okay.
But you like to do it, you even do it like for a fat loss phase because you don't like doing cardio. Well, now you've changed. You like doing cardio.
Matured.
Well, you do more. He's matured. But before, instead of doing an extra session of cardio, you would just prefer to do weight training.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
yeah.
I
So
was
it wasn't
talking
the
about
same
two
strength
training specifically. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
But
same
we
with
do
me,
get there.
it was always the overcompensation. Like we did it before knowing we were going on vacation. So I
Yeah.
was just trying to drive results even more.
But that's fine, though, because, I think we're all on the same page here. Like us, typically, when we go on vacation, we go on vacation.
We vacation hard.
So, yeah, sometimes I try to go train. I get in one of those gyms. I'm like, ugh.
It'll be interesting because by the point this episode actually comes out, we'll have been to Europe. So our goal is to stay somewhat active in Europe.
I mean, we'll be active with our steps.
The last time I strength trained on vacation was...
No, you did it once when we just went on vacation last year.
I did not strength train.
Oh, no,
I
you
did
didn't.
cardio.
I did, yeah.
The last time
You're
I
right.
strength trained, I think we were in Puerto Vallarta, I think. And
I remember.
and then there was
During
this little...
COVID, right?
During COVID, there was this little gym because we were there 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So I'm like, man, I have to train. Get into the gym. The vibe was just whack as hell. There was this like squat rack, loaded up. I did 2 sets of overhead press. Then I'm like, screw this, I can't do it. So, but anyways, to get back to the point. If you're going on vacation and you know that your training is not going to be ideal, well, it's not necessarily a bad thing to get to a point of overreaching prior to allow your 1 or 2 week vacation to act as a super compensation, so that, because this is the truth though, the majority of the time whenever we get back from these vacation, we're actually in better shape.
Yeah.
We feel better, we finally feel recover. We typically lost a little bit of body fat and
that's because
regain
we
some
consistently
fullness.
train all the time.
Yeah. So like personally, I've done very often 2-a-day strength training leading up, like in the mesocycle leading up to a vacation, just as a overreach concept.
Okay. So now we'll keep talking about the 2-a-days with strength training. We'll keep going on that topic.
So one of the big things that people generally do wrong with 2-a-days is they try to do 2 full training sessions. So is it okay? Is a overreaching method in the lead up to a holiday? It's fine. But as a performance enhancement of 2-a-day trainings, which is why people normally implement them, it is too much volume. It's going to be too much to recover from. So once you start implementing 2-a-day resistance-based training, the duration of the training session should be slightly shorter. So anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes is normally the sweet spot. Like a really simple way of implementing 2-a-day trainings is you do your A series as the first training session, and then you do your B and C's as the second training session. But it's going to allow you to, so say your A series could be 8 sets, because we are trying to push volume. It could be more. It could be 10 sets. You never know what it is, but it could be a decent amount of work on a primary compound exercise that you're going to be doing in a fresh state, and then you're going to take 4 to 6 hours in between the 2 sessions, and then you're going to come back and you will have some lingering fatigue, but you're obviously going to be far more recovered for the B and C series than if you had just went straight into it after doing your A series. So you're going to have more output, and it can allow for slightly more sets or a D series as well. But the major thing people have to do is reduce the time involved within the 2 sessions, because it's going to be too much to recover from if you try and do 2 full resistance-based sessions.
I mean, Porrick is 100% right. Like the way you explain it is exactly the basic staple of 2-a-day training. So with our system, we have the A series, B and C series. The A series is the primary, and in a standard session, we spend about 25 minutes on that A series. And then the combined time of the B and C series is about 25 minutes. So now in a 2-a-day training, you split those, but now instead of 25 minutes, maybe you can push it to 30, 35 minutes in both cases. So that's why he's saying that typically in a standard strength session, we might have 4 to 6 sets in the A series. Now it could be 6 to 8 sets.
Are you leaving the rest period the same as what you normally would?
Yeah. And then the B series, where it's typically 3 sets or maybe 4 sets, now it could be 4 or maybe 5 sets. But it's not, it's small increases, because like Porrick is saying, the importance of, or the goal, the objective of the 2-a-day is to use the opportunity of 2 sessions to have a higher average load or higher average output from that training session.
So are we specifically, like with this setup, is this for when you're focusing on driving strength with 2-a-day training?
So this is a good overarching rule. But so if we're specifically getting into strength, yes, this would be very much in the strength category, and you'd be doing your neurological work in the morning, and it's going to be your lower reps, higher sets, compound movement. And then you're going to be doing your assistance work and remedial work in the second session of the day, more in the functional hypertrophy sort of range, hypertrophy range, to drive that side of things.
And then if you switch and say you're trying to drive hypertrophy with 2-a-day training, what's the big change in the sessions?
I mean, what I like is I'll still keep strength-based multi-joint movement in the AM. Simply because, like you still want to work these fast twitch fibers, you still want to have the nervous system involved in a complex pattern. But then the PM, then it's either you train straight up in the hypertrophy zone, or even better, you use like bodybuilding technique. So let's say you're doing a upper body. So let's say your AM is overhead and chin. Well, the PM could be bis and tris in a
Giant set.
post-exhaustion or tri-set or giant set or whatever it might be. So now you're using more isolated movement, and then you drive more volume, so you can increase, hypertrophy potential through increased nutrient storage and on and on and on and on.
Yeah, but one of the big things is, so if it's strength, your AM is more likely going to be down towards the relative strength side of things, whereas if it's hypertrophy, your AM is still going to be it could be relative strength, but it's more likely going to be in the low end of functional hypertrophy. So you're getting that neurological element, you're getting that high threshold work, but it's still going to have more of a contribution to the hypertrophy side of things. And then, as Steph was saying, like the PM session or the second session of the day, the difference is going to be, for strength, you're going to be picking movement patterns and loading zones that are going to contribute to hypertrophy, but still have a very strength bias to them. Whereas for hypertrophy, you could be going the full way to metabolic side of the hypertrophy zone and going for as much reps as possible. Like it's the nuances of the programming, but once you see it on paper, you'd really know the difference.
Yeah. In regards to like using rep schemes with that first session in the day, are you just kind of sticking to what you would normally be using within your periodization, or are you considering that you're doing 2 a day now, so maybe avoiding some more of the advanced rep schemes?
Well, that's a good point. But so since we're doing 2 a day training, and if we're doing it in the manner that Steph laid out during the periodization, so it's falling in one of those more volume-based macro cycles and one of the more volume-based accumulation phases, you may like that your periodization may already call for 5x8 or 8x5. Sorry, that's what I meant to say. So naturally, it just works. And once you're starting to go above 6 sets, it's not impossible to use complex rep schemes, but it's way more likely that you're going to fall back to standard sets with a step loading emphasis, because complex rep schemes, once you get above 6 sets, is brutal. We do it, but it's brutal.
With going back to the hypertrophy again, so the PM sessions being where you're implementing the more bodybuilding style methods, are you pretty much using the same structure for those sessions? Like, are you making any adjustments to it because it is a second session?
I mean, you need to make adjustments if you're using bodybuilding methods, because at this point, like the B1, B2, C1, C2 of assistance and remedial might not fit the bill. For example, let's say you want to work the upper back and you're doing trisets. Well, now it can't be B1, B2, C1, C2, so it's going to have to be like... it depends on how you're doing it, but it could be, let's say, triset for B1, B2, B3 for chest. And then, so you do B1, B2, B3 back to back, and it's chest, chest, chest. Then you have 90 seconds rest. You have B4, B5, B6, back, 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 90 seconds rest. Go back to chest, and you do this for 3-4 sets. Or you could have B1, B2, B3, longer rest, let's say 3 minutes. That's chest triset. And then C1, C2, C3, back tricep, which this approach would be more feasible in a commercial gym. Mm-hmm. But the former approach would be way more beneficial if you have the setup that allows for it. So in that sense, you're breaking the normal program design structure because you have no choice.
I know we often get the question from students that when we're doing giant sets, if someone has a poor work capacity, you could do maybe like chest giant set in the AM, and then you could do the back giant set in the PM. So you're not necessarily, you're still doing 2 a days. The volume's probably going to stay the same, but it's a way to kind of compensate for someone who has.
You're 100% right. That's definitely that's a viable option. but I'm not sure it's necessarily an option that I would plan for in a structured periodization model. It's more something that I would plan for if the phase that we're starting is supposed to be giant sets, and then that we recognize or acknowledge that this specific client has poor work capacity. Then we might be like, you know what, we're going to take the program that we had originally built for you that was meant to be once a day, but we're going to split it. Like you might be doing chest in the AM, back in the PM, quads in the AM, hamstring in the PM, bis in the AM, tris in the PM, just because your client's lack of work capacity, at least you're going to be able to buffer it a little bit so that the average load is higher.
Clients are your personal. I assume some people will have a hard time getting their personal training clients to do that. Moving on, so we covered strength, hypertrophy. Now for the structure for... Well,
there's more to say about strength, though.
Okay.
So let's get back to strength. So the most straightforward approach for strength is, like Porg was saying, A series, B and C series in the PM with a standard session. But if you're dealing with the advanced trainee and you're using 2 a day to really drive strength past the plateau they're at, then you can start playing with training methods. So you could do, for example, like super
maximal eccentrics.
Maximal strength, like type concentric work in the AM, and then in the PM you could do supramaximal eccentrics. So now you're doing high threshold motor unit stuff in the AM, and now in the PM it's higher threshold motor units because it's supramaximal eccentric, but because it's so damaging to the fibers and to the central nervous system, you do it in the PM so that at least you can recover. Because if you were to do supramax in the AM, there's no way you'll be able to do true maximal strength concentric work in the PM efficiently.
And you're talking about an advanced client who you're implementing this to break through strength plateaus.
Yes. And then another option would be to use isometric methods. So in the AM, you could do overcoming isometric, which increases intramuscular tension to a point that's higher than normal concentric. We're talking about 110, 115% above maximum. So you're doing overcoming. So basically you're training the central nervous system to tap into a higher amount of motor units. And then in the PM, you're doing typical maximal strength concentric work. So it's basically the reverse. But the reason why we can do the reverse with the ISO is simply because overcoming isometrics, although it increases tension to a higher level than concentric, it does not create muscle damage. So you're using the ISO basically as a potentiator for the PM session, whereas if you're using eccentric, because the eccentric is so damaging, you need to do it in the PM. But this would only be useful for your really advanced that reached a point where they've plateaued, they've been at 2.2 times body weight squat for a while, and you want to drive it more, let's say. That's what you would do.
Yeah, both those examples would be somewhat more like intensification. So it's not just on the exact same premise. Just because it's such dull, high threshold work, it's not going to fall into the same periodization plan that Steph laid out at the start.
And then regarding training splits for this, are you sticking to upper 1, lower 1, upper 2, lower 2, or is it something where you would implement, say, like the 14-day?
You can definitely implement the 14-day microcycle with that for sure. Like even more so. So if you're advanced and you've been training properly for a while, it means most likely, if you had good program design, that your strength ratios, if you were to look at them on a radar graph, everything would be pretty well balanced. So at that point, there's no limiting lifts. If you want to drive strength overall, the 14-day micro would be great, because now you're driving strength across all primate all the time. Plus, you're mitigating fatigue to a greater level because you're tapping in different motor unit pools every session instead of repeating the same motor unit recruitment over and over and over and over and digging the recovery curve even deeper. So that would be a great option. But I would only really do this if you're somewhat well balanced in a strength ratio perspective.
It's probably too nuanced to get into on an episode regarding like the program design of the actual sessions for 2-a-days, but are there certain exercise selection parameters or that you're really paying attention to when you're designing 2-a-day sessions?
Always, you be careful at cross. What's the expression I'm looking for? Overlap, like overlap of like motor patterns. Like for example, on one lower body day, you have conventional deadlift as your primary. Well, try on your other upper body day, try not to have heavy Romanian deadlift in your PM session. Yeah. Okay, maybe instead have a horizontal back extension. So you're overloading a different point of the strength curve. So at least you're not digging deeper into your recovery curve because you're overloading the same resistance curve point.
Yeah, but it's a lot of the same points that we bring up for any program design. There wouldn't be... It's going to be a lot of the same principles because good program design is good program design. Mm-hmm. And since we're not trying to actually do more exercises, we still have to follow the same thought process and logic.
Okay, so now we can move on to 2-a-day training for driving fat loss and the structure for the 2 sessions.
It depends what you want, but so it could just be 2 weight training sessions and like one functional hypertrophy and one hypertrophy sort of thing, just to drive more volume so you have more output during the day. But it could be like it'd be us stepping away from the 2 resistance training sessions, but it could be 1 resistance training session, 1 conditioning.
Hold on, though. I don't want to go
I know
into those.
That's what I'm saying.
Like I don't want it to cut you off, but to me, my favorite approach if we're doing 2-a-day strength training for fat loss is if I'm doing this, I want to hit the nail as hard as I can because let's do it hard. Let's try to get rid of as much fat as we can quickly so we don't need to do this forever. So to me, my favorite approach is hypertrophy AM, strength endurance PM. Yeah. So it could be like as simple as regular strength workout in the hypertrophy zone, okay, the old school classic 8 to 12 rep. Or it could be a split routine in the AM where you're using bodybuilding methods, but not extreme. I'm not talking about giant sets, like maybe agonist superset or post pre-exhaustion or heavy light. And then in the PM, it's straight up strength endurance, either on the upper lower perspective, or if you have the recovery ability for it,
full body.
Especially if you're using a body part split in the AM, you could actually do a short, like a 20 to maybe 30 minutes, like GBC type, full body strength endurance in the 10 to 20 rep range. Yeah. Not too slow a tempo to not create even more muscle damage. And I mean, this is like
you almost have to think of it as it's almost a cardio session. You're trying to keep the person moving and stuff in the full body, but you're not really trying to tax
and it's one of those
weight.
things.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And it's one of those things where like your first set, you're not going to...
full blown.
No, you leave some reps in the tank because you know that there will be a drop off because the recovery period is so short and the reps are so high, but that's okay because we know that when it comes to body composition purposes and then strength endurance, like the critical drop off is like 50%. Yeah. Okay, so it's not that big of a deal.
And then if we're going to do that approach, one thing you really have to worry out for is your exercise selection. So you don't want to have a lot of exercises that are very bottom end of the strength range dominant. So say you were picking a posterior chain exercise and you wanted something for the mid range, like choose the incline back extension over the RDL because it's going to create less damage. Like, so you just really want to mitigate overall damage because that's going to be brutal.
Yeah.
And I want to emphasize, and this is really important, it's not because you're going for fat loss that you need to disregard peri-workout nutrition.
Yeah. I was thinking that was going to be a whole kind of topic we would touch on at the end of this.
Yeah, but I just want to say that if you're doing this with this high of volume, even if it's fat loss,
don't be stupid.
Make sure you fuel the session because not only do you want to make sure that you're recovering for the next day,
and the next session.
And the next session, you want to make sure that you have the fuel for the session. So that you actually have output. Yeah.
I mean, what you laid out in terms of what you prefer to do for the fat loss 2-a-day training just makes me think of what you just did for me for the Euroshed program, but I wasn't doing 2 a day. It was almost just that was built into the daily undulating of my program. Yeah. So would it be something where, like, say I asked you to do 2-a-day training, would you have chosen to do that with me, or would you still have stuck to what I did because you would still choose 1 session a day versus 2-a-day training?
I mean, for you, I would have chosen 1 a day training because the Euro shred time frame was 5 weeks.
Okay.
But if we had 2 weeks, then I would do 2 a days. Like honestly, 2 a days, more like 2 weeks is great. 3 weeks, you're pushing it. More than 3 weeks, forget about it.
Yeah. I think that's an important point for people to hear, that it's not something that we would encourage to do all keep slamming all the time.
But it's important, like the fat loss intensive course. The
what
guys
it previously was
the one from 2024.
Yeah.
Do you guys remember the first slide that I put after
Fuel.
Train like an athlete,
Recover.
fuel like an athlete, recover like an athlete.
Yeah.
Like to me, this is the mindset that you need to have. So that's why I was saying how important it is to have proper peri-workout nutrition to fuel that training properly. Don't go and do this in a 25% caloric deficit.
And then don't be no carb when you're doing that. Like you definitely want to have some carbs even before each session or in your post-workout shake.
Well, you're going to need a post-workout
but
after
even
the first
pre-workout, I would add just a little bit. Just
I
enough
also
to
really
be
like
to.
the carb during those sessions.
And you don't need a ton, right? The intra,
10,
depending on
grams.
your size, exactly 10, 15, maybe 20 grams if you're a bigger person.
Porrick makes fun of me because I do a half a scoop of pentacarb.
But that's fine.
It's like 12 grams.
For on a blood sugar perspective, that's what you need. But the post-workout, you can afford a little bit more because now you're replenishing for the next session, for the next day. And then you have like the post-workout meals that are also important. But in order to optimize the training response, whatever amount of carbs you're allowing yourself in your diet, the more these carbohydrates are around the training window. I mean, if you're training twice a day, it means it's all day, but the better it is.
Yeah.
I think another important thing to kind of look out for if you're really doing the 2-a-day training and smashing yourself is almost supporting your immune system, because you're going to be slamming your immune system.
That's why the whey protein is like really good for that. Like just around your peri-workout.
Yeah. And why doing for shorter blocks is huge, because once you start pushing past the 2-week mark, your immune system really is going to be taking a battering.
Okay, so one final structure. Anything else on fat loss structure for 2-a-day that anyone has to say?
Not that we're probably not going to cover later.
Okay. So the final structure being for power.
So for power, you're going to look at very similar to you did for strength. So you're going to do your neurological work early in the day, and then what is going to be your strength work later on in the day. So do your power session first. So whether that may still involve max effort work, depending, because it could be contrast training, it could be complex training. So you're training lots of different facets within power. But say it's just a straight up power session, you do your power session first, and then in the PM you bring in your strength work and maybe a bit of functional hypertrophy just to maintain that hypertrophy base. But it's a very similar concept to the more performance side of like the strengths.
Yeah, typically like the faster the movement, the earlier it goes. The slower the movement, the later it goes. So that's why like the power, speed type stuff needs to be done early in the day as opposed to, but
And the plyos.
early in the day. But one really, really important point, if you're training for power, it doesn't matter that you're doing 2 a day or 1 a day. Do not train to maximal voluntary contraction. Do not train to failure.
Mm-hmm.
If you train to failure while you're trying to improve power, it won't happen.
Got to be fresh.
Yeah.
Okay, so now if we want to move into the different implementations of 2 a day, so resistance training and speed work to get us started, moving from power.
I think it's always, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just a quick, but depending on the athlete or the person you're training, you always do what's more important to their sport first. So you would do speed work. Like if you're training a wide receiver, they would do their speed work in the morning, and then they would do their strength work in the PM.
Yeah, like you always have to make sure the most neurologically taxing thing is done first, which when speed work is involved, it's going to be speed work.
Can you be a little bit more specific for listeners what speed work would be?
Track.
Sprinting.
Like proper sprinting, so maximum acceleration, maximum velocity, and it could say it's flying 30s. So you're coming in at a decent pace, you hit the mark, you're hitting max velocity for 30 meters, and then you're just easing off after 30 meters. So stuff like this, that you're really allowing for maximum velocity and maximum outputs. So there's not a conditioning element to this. It is purely the neurological implementation of speed. So there's lots of different ways I could do it, but pretty much maximum acceleration and maximum velocity is the two bigger overarching things, especially for team sports athletes.
On an energy system perspective, we're talking a little bit more of the anaerobic alactic with a little bit of dip into the anaerobic lactic, but it's mostly that alactic burst.
I know you guys are
high-speed
talking
work.
about athletes, but say like Gen Pop, as we always say, we consider ourselves Gen Pop. So in regards to if someone's just getting back to sprint work or wants to do sprints in their training, do you do that before your strength training or after in that scenario?
But it also depends, because what is their sprint training? Is it conditioning or is it speed work? Because if it's conditioning, I'm going to do it after.
Yeah.
So it depends the setup of the sprint work. If they are properly doing sprints and trying to hit the highest velocities as possible, okay, that's fine. They can do that first. But they also have to know that that is done in the context of very minimum, like a 7% critical drop-off. So you're not creating a ton of fatigue. You're taking long rest periods. You're doing this for high quality. Whereas conditioning, you can afford to have a little bit more fatigue. So it just wouldn't be as advantageous to do that before a weight training session. So it just depends on what they consider.
When I was competing, I remember one of my training blocks was I would do the weight training in the morning, and I would do sprints, but I mean, sprinting is not sprinting so fast, but it was definitely still more for fat loss. So even if it was lactic, I would still did it in the afternoon, because I don't think, and it also depends on like where, like your situation. I was in St. Louis at the time. It was super hot. There was no way I would be able to do sprint work when it's 110 degrees in the morning and then be able to weight train in the afternoon. So
yeah, but at least you were still doing like lactic capacity type stuff. So it's not, the forces and the velocities are not as drastic. It's just that on top of the whole performance perspective, one of the issues, especially if you're untrained, if you're Gen Pop, reintroduces like sprint. Okay, I'm not talking about conditioning, but sprinting. It's already risky. So if you're doing sprints and you're trying to go to your highest velocity, which means that you're pushing stride length to your maximum potential, and you're doing this after strength work and you had a decent strength training session, you're putting yourself at risk of tweaks and tears way more.
yeah, for sure.
Okay. So there's already a risk. Like if you're untrained and you go, okay, now I'm going to sprint, you haven't sprinted in years, you're putting yourself at risk anyways. But putting it post strength, it's an even greater risk.
Yeah. So anyone in that position, we recommend starting with a hill.
Yeah.
You do not need to do it flat. You can be exposed to more than enough velocity going up hills.
And then, so that kind of carries on because it's been mentioned a few times, resistance training with energy systems sessions.
Yeah, well, okay. So energy system, that's a very wide, broad term. So energy system training can include speed, can include conditioning. Okay, so it just depends what we're saying here with energy system. But let's say that we're going to work on energy systems on a machine, like an exercise machine.
Yep.
Then you could argue that the alactic power and capacity should be done pre-strength. But because it's a machine, like if it's a bike, for example, the risk of injury is not, there's none. Are we really looking at increased bike velocity performance, or are we really just training the anaerobic alactic system, right? Okay. So if it's just very general, it won't be a big deal if you're doing it post, okay? It's just that track work, when we're talking about true speed development and you have the forces of the ground striking the ground and the G-forces, that's a completely different story. But if you're doing energy systems on a machine,
it's not the same.
It's not the same, right? So, but the energy system, so you have the alactic power capacity, lactic power capacity, and then you have the aerobic power capacity. All of these can be done in an exercise machine. Most of them, I would recommend you do post-strength training. But the alactic power and capacity, you could argue, could be done either or.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So running and sprinting definitely throw a bit of a curveball because of the higher injury risks. But once you're doing it in a machine, you're pretty safe. Yeah.
As long as you don't trip on this step mill as you're trying to fly.
Also, don't do alactic power on a step mill.
Let's try.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, right? So, like alactic work will work very well on the assault bike, for example, but will be very, very shitty on a life cycle, like typical. Right, but on the flip side, aerobic power will work better on a life cycle bike than a assault bike. Not that you can't.
Yeah. It's just harder to gauge.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to resistance training and conditioning modified strongman work sessions.
So this would be my go-to for fat loss.
Yeah.
If I was going to do 2 days, this is how I would set it up. So you do your resistance training in the morning, whatever quality that you deem that you want to be training, and then you do a modified strongman in the afternoon. So you're getting a lot of the same benefits as the strength endurance session that Steph brought up, but you're probably going to generate more concentric actions. So generate more waste products and all that great stuff.
less overall fatigue as well.
Less overall fatigue. But what I love about this is that it's very concentric dominant.
Yeah, it's just so different that it's...
Yeah, so different velocities, different movement patterns. So you can really set this up that it's not as draining on your recovery and while getting a huge amount of output. This
would be my go-to as well. Yeah. Like this to me would be the holy grail of training scenario for fat loss.
Is there a specific interval out of all the intervals that we use that you'd go to, or would it be kind of...
There is. I mean, I don't know if you wanted to answer that.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so to me, like for the context of fat loss purely, to me, we're talking about like maximum aerobic power and anaerobic lactic capacity. These are like the 2 zone where in my opinion, you'll get the most bang for your buck in terms of fat loss. So, but because it's modified strongman conditioning, because of the risk involved with a long duration bout of these, like for example, yes, you can work the aerobic system with a 3-minute interval, But can you imagine doing
Nope.
the yoke for 3 minutes? You're going to mess up your ankle. Okay, so it's not practical. So intervals that last anywhere from 15 to 20 seconds in length all the way up to maybe like, let's say 60 seconds at the longest is great. And then you work with 1 to 3, 1 to 2, or 1 to 1. And in some cases, 1 to 0.5 work to rest ratio. You should be pretty good to go in terms of hitting the big money maker work to rest ratio for fat loss purposes.
Yeah.
The final one, we kind of briefly touched on it in the last episode, but resistance training with mobility work. And I think it is important to kind of clarify what we're talking about for mobility work.
I mean, I think that, for mobility, we're talking like FRC type of stuff, or PNF, like things like that, but also with static stretching and stuff. I would definitely do the weight training in the morning and then keep that for in the evening, even before bed. They say Steph will be able to tell you the reason why, the study that came up with stretching right before bed and doing all that stuff. Like your muscles are more relaxed. And it helps you even get into better sleep, that you get more benefit from doing it later in the day than earlier in the day.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what happens is you can't, like, okay, in any circumstance, it's better to do mobility work than none at all.
Yeah.
But right after a training session, the problem sometimes is now you've spent like 60 minutes basically binding actin and myosins together to create forceful contraction. You have blood within the tissue. So everything is constricted. That's where the fibers are. That's where your body is at this point in time. So now if let's say you're doing static stretching after, now you're trying to go against
what you just did.
Yeah. So it's just a little harder because now you're beyond just warmed up. Okay, so it's a little bit harder to get the full benefits of stretching. That's why they're saying that ideally, most like Olympic level athletes, for example, like they tend to do their mobility work about 4 to 6 hours post strength training. But ideally, to do it at night, what's good is you're more relaxed. So the parasympathetic nervous system is kicked in. Everything is more chill. Now there's no such thing as blood and the muscle and actin and myosin bind together. And now if you're doing stretching, either FRC or long duration static stretching, you're creating microtrauma to the tissue and the connective tissue to allow for a longer range of motion. And then what happens is, now following that session, if you're going to bed, so we know that during sleep is when you're releasing the highest surge of growth hormone. And growth hormone is a highly potent regenerative hormone that rebuilds connective tissue. So now you've created some type of a stress with the stretching, and now with the sleep and the burst in growth hormone, you're improving the repair of the tissue to kind of solidify that newfound range of motion. So in a perfect world, if you can do this, do that. If not, it doesn't matter. Do mobility either or. Even if it's right after the session, it's still better than nothing else. And then to add to what Alex was saying, now you also need to differentiate mobility work for the sake of improving range of motion and mobility work for the sake of a dynamic warm-up. Okay? So now if you're doing a dynamic warm-up to send a signal to the brain and the tissue of upcoming range of motion needs for the strength training session, then you can do dynamic type flexibility work for a short amount of volumes right before the session, simply to aid in the functionality of your strength session, but it's not necessarily mobility work that will improve range of motion. Okay, so that's important to understand. But like we were talking in the previous podcast about how we like FRC and how effective it is. Well, FRC is highly demanding. FRC is basically a strength training session in a way. So you're better off doing this later after.
And like when we brought up that twice a day training should be done very sparingly and sporadically, that was mostly in consideration to 2-a-day resistance training. Yeah. So this sort of thing wouldn't fall under that.
Yeah, because 2 a day. So like right now, right? Like I've been doing 2 a days for a long period of time, but my second session, I'm doing it mostly for health purposes, but it's zone 2, steady state aerobic work. I mean, it's not. Doesn't require recovery so much, except your legs. I know because I do it 5 days a week for an hour. But it's still not. It's fine. Mm-hmm. It's not something that you need to be overly concerned with.
Yeah, it's not neurologically taxing.
Not at all. And then, especially for me, I like the elliptical, right? Because it's a low impact, so it allows me to do the volume that I want to do, while mitigating even more the stress on joints.
Yeah. And then I know we've had some clients that don't have 2-a-day training, but their sessions end up being 2-a-day just because of the way their client structures are. Yeah. And that's also not as big a deal because they're not accounting for any additional volume. Yeah. So they're still just doing the prescribed volume that was set out in the first hand. They just didn't have the time to do it all in one shot. It's maybe not always ideal because they will get more output, so they'll be slightly more draining, but it's not as big a deal.
Like the Bulgarians, and I know the Kazakhs is the same thing. The reasons why their Olympic lifting teams like have multiple training sessions a day is to basically leverage training to its maximum potential, because we know that strength training triggers a anabolic response. So in a way, on a theoretical perspective, the more bouts of strength training per week you can have, the higher the amount of anabolic windows you're promoting for growth. But the reason why in real life it's a hard thing to do is most people don't have the lifestyle that allows for that high amount of frequency of training. But them, they train 20 minutes for the most part,
those
multiple times a day.
So different too. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like frequency, recovery, but because they have such short workouts, their output is high all the time. Yeah. So they never deal with, for us, like our C series sometimes, like that's why Porik in the previous podcast was talking about the 1RM continuum only really makes sense for the A series, because once you get to B and C series, you have so much built-in fatigue that there's no way that your 78% of 1RM is your actual 8 rep on a C1 exercise. Yeah. Okay.
But there is a funny story behind the Bulgarians, because, and I'm not going to get all the facts perfect here, but the overarching things right. They were told they're allowed, I think it was 3 training sessions per day. But at the time, they were doing like 8 or 9. But they're all these 20-minute sessions. But the definition of a training session was 2 bouts of training that were more than 30 minutes apart. So what they did was a 20-minute session with a 29-minute rest period. So it counted as one session. Then they did that for a couple hours, broke, so they had a longer break, did another one, broke, and they did another one. So they worked the system.
Yeah, it's true, because when you look at I've never noticed that, but when you look at their schedule, they always had these 2 quick sessions before lunch.
Yep.
Then they had an extended period with lunch, and okay, it makes sense.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Okay. Are there any other topics that anyone specifically wanted to point out with 2-a-day training?
Do we need to touch any more on the nutrition around it? Or we've said enough?
But I'm talking about the programming, periodization. I think we covered a decent amount. Yeah. But again, so back to nutrition for 2-a-days training. As we mentioned, we don't recommend going into a massive deficit when you're implementing 2-a-day training, because as we've emphasized throughout the episode, recovery is such a big part with 2-a-day training, and you're just not going to be able to recover if you're in a massive deficit.
People just need to change their mindset in terms of if you fuel, like think of high octane fuel, you want to, like you'll have more output. So that's the whole goal of this. You want to be able to eat enough to be able to train really, really hard more than, have more output than you normally would. So you definitely have to, like I said before, I would definitely not do a low carb 2-week macro macro with the food.
And hit peri-workout nutrition for each session.
And then definitely don't do it fasted. Yeah. I mean, we know that fasted doesn't actually lead to more fat loss, so there's no point in ever doing it fasted, but I would definitely try to have some carbs and protein before, during, after, and then really focus on your peri-workout nutrition. Make sure you're getting all your other nutrition, high leucine meals and stuff, but peri-workout is going to make a big difference.
And then meal timing is going to be huge.
Yeah.
Because so with 2-a-day training, you want 4 to 6 hours between the 2 sessions. So ideally you're having a post-workout shake and a meal. And then pre-workout all within that window. So you have to set up your day that it's all going to be structured, that you're getting enough fuel in, because...
And if you can't do it, then you shouldn't be doing 2-a-day.
Exactly. It is an advanced technique for a lot of reasons, not just your training age. It's what has your commitment been, the training and lifestyle factors over the years. So meal timing gets really important. So and even your session timing gets really important, because ideally you're going to do your first session within 2 hours after your breakfast. So the rest of your day doesn't look completely crammed. So it's one of those that you're eating breakfast, it's digesting, you're going in, you're training, you're having all your peri-workout stuff, you're having your post-workout, you're having about 2 hours later, you're having your post-workout meal. So it's 2 hours before the next session. Then you're starting that process all over again. So you have to be prepared.
And I want to be clear too, we're talking about fat loss. Obviously, you need a deficit in order to create fat loss. But people have to understand that to create a deficit, it doesn't just need to be through a food deficit. So you can be at a maintenance food intake, but generate your deficit via the training session.
Yeah, that's how you have to see it.
So at least now you're able to fuel yourself to have a higher level training session, so that training session can actually create or generate more output to create a bigger deficit. Because if you're doing a deficit in calories to a point where it affects your output and your training motivation is low, because that's the thing too, right? If you're tired and sluggish because you're not eating enough, your training motivation is low. Yeah. When your training motivation is low, it's a completely natural mechanism to, by default, having a much less output. To your coach, you're going to look like you're giving it your all, but you're not. So now the output might be half of what it would normally. Okay, so now you're not really helping yourself. So at least if you're favoring proper recovery and training hard, then you can use the training to help with fat loss. And then once you hit a plateau with this for a short, and understand that 2 days, even for fat loss, we're talking about a short period of time. Then once you decrease the training frequency, now you can start thinking about addressing nutrition on a deficit perspective.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so just as a reminder, we do have 2 programs in the Train Heroic Marketplace, Intensity and Tempo Town. So for $49 a month, you can hop in and...
29?
Yeah.
29.
Okay, oops. Okay. Well, that's good. Can hop in get
she
some
makes me doubt.
programming.
No, I'm pretty sure it is.
Okay.
Other than that, keep on listening. Drop us a like, a share, a subscribe. Thanks for tuning in, fam.